For a quick impromptu live session, I want to take a minute and just talk through thyroid medications and how they compare. I've got an image I'm going to share with you all that makes it really easy to make sense out of these things. It's, people put a lot of thought into which one they're on, which ones are the best, if they should change, how that might make a difference. And more, I think that people can do better on less, and they can have a better chance of tapering off than I would thought in the past. But those who are on, here's a good way to understand how these various things relate. Okay, I'm going to pull up an image real quick here, and here we go. All right, so this is big, and this has a lot of details inside of it, right? So I'm due to update this. Actually, Thyroid, they've made some new potencies that I don't have listed, and it's actually going to screw up the whole system. So I've got to rework this after those are available. But in the meantime, this is still pretty accurate. So here's what we got. Each column represents a different type of medication. So the first column here to the very left, this is just saying the various products and their potencies. And the first column is talking about the potencies in their equivalencies as grain units. So natural desiccated thyroid, they talk about those both in terms of grains and also in terms of milligrams. And just as a heading for each of those rows, I use those by grain units to start. Now, as we work to the right, we've got WP Thyroid and Nature Thyroid. Those are products from the same manufacturer. Armor NP Thyroid. This first big group is all natural desiccated thyroid. And the end of that, we've got compounded. This next series of 3 columns represents T4 only medication. We've got levothyroid, Laboxyl, Synthroid, and then also generics for those, Tirosint, and compounded T4. And these last two columns represent T3 only medications. There used to be a T3, T4 combo called Thyrolar, no longer around, so that allowed me to take out a column, but yeah, no longer in existence. And the first row across, what we're seeing is the product names. Next row is the variation. That's how much they could be expected to fluctuate from batch to batch based upon either the USP guidelines or manufacturer's information. So yeah, we can see that that's different from product to product. Compounded meds, that can be unknown. Now there are examples to where compounded medications do have quality control after production. And that does take being specific about particular pharmacies. Not all pharmacies do that, but some do, and they can do a good job at that. But there's not strict guidelines for it. Then we see the fillers. And these differ from product to product. We can see that some have various pretty long lists, and they're similar from one to the next. But yeah, these were just far too long to list out. And then we can see some that have shorter lists. Compounded medications, there is leeway on that. That's one perk, is that the doctor can make suggestions for hypoallergenic or certain binders or fillers. There are some versions of compounded NDT that can use baking soda, which is pretty inert stuff. Next down, what we see is the various rows. And each row is kind of the same potency from thing to thing in the row. Like for example, if we go down to the row that starts at 1, so under the very first column it goes down to 1 for grain units. And then we see that for WP, for Nature Thyroid, those are both considered 65 milligrams. Those are ones that are made in that potency. We have 60 for Armor and NP, and then 1 grain for compounded. Quick note about this. Within the manufacturers of natural thyroid, they don't go by the same milligram guidelines. However, in terms of grains, they are potency equivalents. So even though that Nature Thyroid is 65 milligrams and Armor is 60, they're both 1 grain potencies, and the active ingredients are per the grain, not per the milligram. So those are dose equivalents. Now, we start comparing that over here to the synthetics. And these are dose equivalents, and I've got to say, we need some way to have an understanding of dose equivalents. But these really are apples and oranges. They work quite differently from person to person. So a grain of natural thyroid is in the ballpark of 100 micrograms of T4 only. Now, if you look at that 100 micrograms, that's a whole lot less than that 60 milligrams that you see for Armour, or the 65 milligrams for Nature Thyroid. A milligram is 1,000 micrograms. So that's really 60,000 micrograms for Armour compared to 100 micrograms for Levoxyl. So what's up with that? Well, here's what's up with that. The labeling for natural thyroid is based upon how much material you've got, because the material itself has the active ingredients. The labeling for the synthetics is based on the active ingredient. So there's 100 micrograms of T4 in 100 micrograms of T4. Whereas in natural thyroid, the T4 and the T3 content is available, but the potency is not based upon them. It's based upon how much powder that you have for raw material. I'm seeing some questions come up. Thank you for that. Hang tight. I'm not going to talk too much longer, and when I'm done, I will grab some of these questions. So stay with me, and I will get to that. So along the row, these are approximate potencies. The T3 relative to T4 potency, I see different numbers about that. Many will say 5 to 1, 5 parts of T4 equals about 1 part of T3. Some say 4 to 1. They are different, and so it's always impossible to make exact equivalencies, but those are probably good ballparks. So 1 grain of natural thyroid is about 100 micrograms of T4, or about 20 micrograms of T3. So if someone was on 100 micrograms of T4 and they wish to switch to natural thyroid, they're probably going to be in the ballpark of about 1 grain. For some logistics, when someone does change, I often like them to go a baby step down first. It will always take a couple of retests and adjustments. Well, it will usually take that to get someone right. And there are times to where if you go straight across this row from like 100 micrograms to 1 grain, it might be too little, but it also might be too much. And too much is pretty dangerous. So when I guide people, I generally encourage them to go down slightly when they're switching and then adjust as needed. It does suck to get less than you need, but it's dangerous to get more than you need. So please do know that whenever you do change categories of medicine, even just changing brands of medicine in the same category, you'll probably need a couple of measurements short term and a few adjustments to get it right. And that's why it's tough to change brands, even within that same category. So more questions, comments coming up. I'll keep an eye out for these. A few more just points about what this all means. So there's some colors here. It's kind of like yellow, orange, red, darker red. So what those represent is, kind of like a yellow light, red light, or amber light type thing. And these high potencies at the very bottom, like this 5 grain, 500 micrograms, those are not commonly needed. I will often hear of people who are on 3 grain doses of natural thyroid, or 200 microgram doses of T4, or like 50 microgram doses of T3, or some combination. And if we look at body weight requirements, we wouldn't expect anyone to need that much. And in almost all those cases, the labs say they're getting way too much and it's not safe for them. So body weight requirements, for every pound of body weight, this will differ per gender and per menopausal status, a few other factors, but each pound of body weight, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 0.7 to 0.8 tenths of a microgram of T4. So you can start out with even simpler, with about like a microgram of T4 per pound, and then go down just a little bit. So it's somewhere around there. So you could look at this graph and say, okay, so if I was 175 pounds, I probably need a little less than that 175 microgram of T4. So I could see that row, look at that row for what it is, 1.7 grains, or 113.75 milligrams for Nature Thyroid. And I can also look at the row just below that. That's about what I would need, but I wouldn't be expected to need more than that. If I needed more than that, one of a couple things would be happening. Either I'd be getting too much, or I'd be not absorbing it properly, or I wasn't testing right. So another thing too, or I wasn't taking it in a way that was working well. There's something off like that. So if you need way more than one would expect per body weight, there's probably something not right. And there are people who are larger and just need larger amounts because of their body size. That's totally fine. But yeah, a person who's roughly 200 pounds, if their thyroid was taken out, they wouldn't need more than 200 micrograms of T4 or 2 grains of natural thyroid. So that's kind of what those red things represent. But yeah, big picture, each column is a product. Each group of columns is a category of products. We got natural desiccated, T4 only, T3. And each row is a potency that's roughly equivalent. So I don't know if I said this already, but Tirosint made several new potencies, and they don't fit in any of these rows. So I'm going to have to make like 4 new rows that are going to be all empty except for just for Tirosint. Oh, one more point. So each box that's empty, that just means that's a potency that is not made from that manufacturer. So let's take a look for an example. If we're seeing the T4 only, let's say the, sure, so Tirosint, there's not a 300 microgram. It's just not made, so that's empty. And as I'm looking at that, I'm going to redo this. The compounded meds really don't have to have empty spots because they can be made in whatever potency. But when we see things like for Nature Thyroid, for example, or I should say Armor Thyroid, they don't have a 0.75 grain dose. They just don't make that. So that's just not available in that potency. So yeah, all the ones that have numbers filled in are products that are made in those potencies. So that's kind of the gist of that. Few more general ideas, then I'll start hitting some of these good questions that are coming in. NDT can be good for monotherapy for many people. It can be used with T4. T4 can be used for monotherapy as a standalone. That doesn't work great for everyone. None of these work great for everyone. So I'm just talking about some of the best options. So T4 can work well as monotherapy for some. It can work with some natural thyroid. It can work with some T3. T3 by itself is not encouraged for monotherapy. The reason for that is we used to think that T4 was just a box that gave you T3. We now know that it's not. It's not just a box. It's something that's important all by itself. So yeah, we need all of these hormones. And if you're taking something like T3, not only is it not giving you T4, but it can often lower your own output. So you can end up with too little of that. So yeah, so I should explain. So monotherapy is just like one thing. It's one medicine. So you can use NDT all by itself. You could use T4 all by itself, or you could combine those two, or you could combine T4 and T3. But T3 is the one that's different in that it's not recommended for use all by itself. Okay, so let's grab a couple questions here. There's some really cool questions, you guys. Thank you for this. This is from Laner, who's been patiently waiting and put this one up here right away. Thank you for that. And has WP, let me just put this question up, make that visible. Has WP or Nature Thyroid by same company become available at CVS now? I am on Armor. Is it just as good? Yeah, Laner, good question there. So is it available? The pharmacies are different in what they have access to, what they have stock. Normally not. There's not much coming out from them. I actually spoke to the manufacturers recently. Good people, good friends. Those who do like their medication and prefer it, probably a better option is to have the raw materials compounded by a compounding pharmacy. There's a group called SPL, and they're the company that makes the raw materials that went in to make WP Thyroid and Nature Thyroid. And as of this point, they do now make their powder available for compounding pharmacies. So if that was really a good fit for you, if Armor is working well, it's an equivalent in a lot of ways. But for some people, one brand is just the thing that lights them up and the others just do not work well. So if that's you, you can have a compounding pharmacy work with SPL. I'm not tied to any. There is one in Arizona called Foothills Pharmacy. They started this process. They do ship to all states with the exception of Alabama and Mississippi, I'm pretty sure. So that is an option that's available. Otherwise, Armor really is an equivalent product, and many can do well with that. Okay, let me just reread Laner's question there. Yeah, not readily available. And if you did already switch and you already adjusted on Armor, I would see no strong reason to switch back. Other considerations can be cost differences that come up from brand to brand. Armor can be a little higher than some others, so there is that. But as far as active ingredients, really shouldn't be big differences that way. Inactive ingredients can differ. So related one, Barb, any ETA for the return of WP? You know, I did just ask that question to the company a couple of days ago, and There are chances for a few batches to come out in the coming months. I my crystal ball does not suggest that it will be available long term. So if it does can become available again. So Barb, I really would think about other options. And even if it were available temporarily, we've got that whole switching brands thing. And that's hard for people. Even to go like in this chart, even if you're looking at across the row from one thing to the next, even though they should be about the same potency, they don't always work the same. And it's probably the inactive ingredients and just how they work with your particular tummy and your system that it's not always the same. So it's always a process to change brands. So I would just minimize that as much as possible. Oh, I see. So Laner, follow-up one. I'm on a weird 60 plus 15 and armor to equal 75. That's a great comment, and thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mentioned how some potencies are made by some manufacturers, some are not. This specific case, you found the exact best workaround. So thankfully, Armor and NP do make 15 milligram tablets, and those can be added to other tablets to equal some of the in-between potencies that are not made. The drawback is that it can be more cost, it can be an extra pill, but it can be done. That is also a consideration with compounding. You can choose those in-between potencies and they can be made that way. Here's one from Jamie. For those with Hashimoto's, what do you normally see or give medication-wise? So Jamie, funny thing, the difference between T4 and NDT, there's a lot of differences. There are many people, and I should even back up a further step, Jamie. So there's those already on medication, those not yet on medication. Let me answer to the second category first. So those not yet on medication, I see a whole lot of people that seem like they would be candidates based upon their blood levels and their symptoms. They've got obvious Hashimoto's, they're hypothyroid, they're subclinical hypothyroid, they're suboptimal. And with the ideas in the thyroid reset diet, the vast majority of them do not need to start thyroid therapy. So the clinical trials have shown that once you take out people that didn't comply, that didn't do the diet, and everyone else, 97% of people get radically better, and a big 80% or more completely reverse their thyroid disease within a few months. So Jamie, I no longer lead with thyroid medication for those who are not on it, unless someone doesn't have a thyroid. There's a few other situations to where, of course, they will need it. They'll need it long term. But barring things like that, when the thyroid is slowed down from a disease, the vast majority of people can forego treatment with medication. And that's pretty cool. So that's what the whole thyroid reset diet is all about. You can also go to invisibleiodine.com for some just free, easy ideas about that. But it's pretty exciting stuff. Now, for those already on medication, this still largely applies. So one study looked at people on medication and gave them some very basic instructions to regulate iodine, not very thorough, but just very basic. And what they saw was that 84% of people needed less medication and didn't get symptoms come back, didn't have their levels become unstable. They could safely reduce their medicine. Of that 84%, half of them didn't need medicine at all. They could taper completely off and keep stable blood levels and not develop symptoms, not have symptoms come back. So that's what I really lead with. So I wanted to talk about the medication just because people wonder about that. But Jamie, when someone really says, "How do I get better?" That's not the cake. The cake is really the iodine regulation. And many people on meds can need less or none. Those people not on meds probably would not need to start on them. Okay, different follow-up question here from Jamie. What different body effects are caused when your T3 or T4 levels are off? So Jamie, funny thing, I would dissect that question a little bit. There's a common understanding that TSH levels are healthier when they're in the low end of the normal range. Many get that. The TSH is backward. The higher it is, the more you lack thyroid. The lower it is, the more you're heading toward too much. And healthy people are on that low side. They're not getting too much, but they're on the low side of normal, right? And many then assume that therefore T4 and T3 should be on the high side of normal. And with a really superficial understanding of thyroid hormones, it makes perfect sense. But with the deeper understanding, what goes on is your body has a set point for T3 and T4. And the TSH is really just whether your thyroid needs to put out more or put out less. it's the first thing to change as your needs shift. Once you've got thyroid hormone, your set point determines how your T3 and T4 levels are. So it's not based on how much you're taking, it's based on your body's set point. Now, if you're completely lacking thyroid hormone, then yeah, there's nothing you can adjust. It's going to be low. And when you've got way too much thyroid hormone, there's no way you can adjust that either. There's going to be too much T3 and T4. But between those ridiculous extremes, the T3 and T4 levels are not about your dose, they're about your set point. So I don't really think many talk about these nuances of T3 being high normal, all that stuff. I don't see the evidence behind that, and understanding the set point model of T3 and T4 regulation, I don't encourage people dosing or putting a lot of thought into that. It can be relevant for how your health works, but the solution to T3 and T4, if they're off, is not a matter of changing a thyroid dose. It's a matter of helping your body with that set point. So yeah, that might have been a little deep, but hopefully that made some sense. So I'm just following up on some of these remaining comments here for a minute or two. Armor was stronger for me, it seems. Rather saying something my insurance pays for. Yeah, valid concern. Jamie, yeah, I'm not on medication, but thinking I need to be. Yeah, Jamie, please just grab the Thyroid Reset diet. That's what that's all about. And see how you do over the course of a couple months. So one study, a little more depth, they took people who had average TSH scores of 14.1. They were pretty badly hypothyroid. They had been there for about 4 years. Like you, they had Hashimoto's, and like you, they were not yet on medication. They put them in two groups. One group was put on what is now the Thyroid Reset diet. One group was not. The group that was not didn't get better. Some got worse. All stayed at least the same or got worse. The group that was put on the diet, in 3 months, 78.3% of them were perfectly normal. Their TSH scores were under 3. 78.3%. So the remaining 21.7%, got it that time, the remaining 21%, one group of them wasn't compliant. They just didn't follow through with the diet recommendations. So it doesn't really count the fact they didn't get better, right? Another group of them, they improved, but they didn't yet get better because their starting TSH was like 100 to 200. So they were so far off, but cool thing was they were still improving. But they didn't go into that 78% that recovered because they didn't get below 3. So the remaining people, so of those who were compliant and didn't improve at all, that was only about 3%. So Jamie, you got darn good odds of radically improving and possibly not needing ongoing treatment. So yeah, Nira, the best way to get off meds. So yeah, the first thing, Nira, is really just the Thyroid Reset diet ideas and work with a doctor. And basically what happens is, as your body makes more thyroid hormone, your scores will show that you need less. The same dose that was enough will start to become too much. And a doctor needs to understand that and gently reduce your dose and give your body room. Now, many people are over-medicated. Many people have their TSH too low because they're given too high of a dose of thyroid medicine. In that situation, it's darn near impossible for the thyroid to recover because the TSH causes the thyroid cells to grow. And if it's too low, the cells can't grow. And if they can't grow, the thyroid can't get better. So you've got to be on a reasonable amount to start with, a reasonable amount of medication. And then it does take work with the doctor to gently taper. You can't just drop it because that's a trauma too, but it does take some tapering based upon how your scores shift. Jamie, thank you for those hearts. I'm super encouraged for you. I'd love to hear follow up on how you do. You know, and if you don't know, this is a different time for me. I'm on pretty much every Monday at 3 Pacific, aka 6 Eastern for office hours live. Kind of like this, but more formal, a little more detailed. One last one. I'm going to wrap it up from Laner. Will you be making a reset shake without stevia? Prefer not to take stevia. Is that a possibility? From Elaine. That's cool. You know, I'm actually reformulating a few things right now, and I'm toying with the idea. So, Elaine, we have a RS Complete, and that's the resistant starch fraction from the Daily Reset Shake. And I'm toying with the idea of making just an unflavored protein shake that one could combine with the RS Complete. So it wouldn't be a standalone exact approximation of the Reset Shake, but it would be two things you could use to make that happen. So If you're still, I see a smiley face. Okay, I'll take that as a thumbs up vote, and I'll put that into consideration with the whole formulation process. All right, good to see you guys. This was just a quick one. I had this chart, I was playing with it, and realized that Tyrosine ruined it for me, and I got to redo it, but I thought it might be useful. So good to see you guys. Have a great long weekend coming up, and we'll talk again really soon. Bye-bye.